All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining Automation Hour. We are thrilled that you're here with us today on October 1st. So happy first day of the month and 30 days left until Halloween. So a few logistics to get us started. We are going to mute all lines. If you've got questions, you can please post those in our Salesforce Automation Hour Trailblazer community. We will also be keeping an eye on the questions widget here in the GoToWebinar session, so you can ask them there as well. We are recording the session and it will be posted after today's session is completed. As always, we invite you to have some additional resources in your flow journey. Number one, the Trailblazer community group for Salesforce Automation Hour, as well as our website, automationhour.com. And we are also newly on Twitter, so go ahead and follow us on Automation Hour if you would there as well. All right, so we have some fantastic sessions coming up for the rest of the year, and we are busily working on getting presenters for the first half of next year. So if you have an automation use case that you would like to present, please reach out to us and we would love to get you on our schedule. So we've got several great presentations coming up throughout October, November, and into December before the holidays. As always, we cannot bring these sessions to you without our amazing sponsors. So we want to give a shout out to ActiveCampaign, who is helping us out with promoting these sessions so everyone knows to attend, as well as Concrete.io, who has been with us since the inception of this event about 5 years ago. So here are your co-founders that started Automation Hour about 5 years ago. Unfortunately, some have had to move on as time has shifted. And so your current co-hosts are me, Michelle Hansen, as well as Rakesh Gupta. So today we are thrilled to bring you a presentation from Eric Smith. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to him and let him kick things off today. So Eric, I am making you presenter.
So. Wonderful. Share a screen with you guys. Okay. I should have the screen up there. Thank you, Michelle and Rakesh, for having me again on Automation Hour. It's always fun to be here, either to present or to listen what other wonderful things people are doing with automation and Salesforce. So I certainly appreciate being able to share with you guys. So my name is Eric Smith. I work as a technical architect for a Salesforce consulting partner, Gears CRM. I'm a Salesforce MVP. I have my own blog. I've presented a number of different events locally, in person, virtually, all over the world. It's been a blast. I'm a Trailhead Ranger, 5-time certified, and an active contributor to unofficialsf.com. And you can always find me on Twitter at @esmith35. Today, I want to talk about a component I created for flows because I ran into a use case that maybe some of you others have had as well. And that has to do with how do you handle validations in a flow. So I have a validation checker flow component. And the reason for that is you may have seen a screen that looks like this before where you get that red message pops up, says an unhandled fault has occurred in the flow. And that's really all the user gets to see. Not a very good experience for them, and it's not a very good experience for you as an admin either, especially when you get to open your email and you start to look at an email debug log of what was going on in the flow, and you're trying to make heads and tails out of that and try and understand what's going on. So what could cause these types of errors? Basically, it's when your users are entering data on a flow screen that ends up being invalid when you go to save or update a record. And some of the things that can cause these validation errors is you can enter more characters than what the field allows. Sometimes a user might trip a validation rule. They might leave a required field empty, bypass a lookup filter. They might enter duplicate records. So basically the questions are, do your users ever enter this invalid data on their flow screens? If they don't, thank you very much. Have a great day. I'm glad to be here and enjoy your weekend. If we can all move on. But I think you may have run into this before. So what I'd like to do is basically demonstrate a few cases where this happens. Now, I pre-recorded some of these demonstrations, so I'm going to try and keep up with the narrative as it goes through them, but I apologize if I get a little bit out of sync while we go through that. I just didn't want to take the chance of doing a live demo during a live presentation. So what you're going to see for the videos on the screen are pre-recorded, but I'll try and explain what's happening as we go through them. So what I have here is a flow that is basically it's getting some information, and it's going to try and take that information and create a record. And hopefully, if there are no errors, it'll move on and finish the flow. But if, in fact, I enter something in on this screen and try and update a record, and it causes an error, I'm going to get this message instead of my flow completing, or instead of any other way of letting the user know that what they were doing wasn't going to work in this particular situation. There's my email message that comes because we got the error, and that's what you have to try and look at to determine, what did the user do that caused this particular error, and what can I do to my flow, or what can I do in my training of my users to avoid this in the future. In this particular case, let's go look at some of the things that can cause this. If we just look at how we set up our records and our objects, we can create validation rules. And if a user fails a validation rule, it's going to cause your flow to fail. I've seen some objects out there in organizations, they have dozens and dozens of validation rules. Other things that could cause a flow to trip up when somebody goes to enter information would be if you have a field that's required and you don't make it required on your flow screen, so the user skips over it. You try and write your record, it's going to generate an error, and your flow is going to fail because a required field is missing. Lookup filters can cause issues as well if you don't match a lookup filter when you're trying to create or update records. Let's take a look at a couple other things that cause flows just to stop working and cause an error. Let's bring up another field here. The size of a field. If we have a text field, here's one that's 10 characters long, and you let the user type in 28 characters, you go to save that record, your flow is going to fail, and they're going to get an error message. Duplicate rules. If they're entering multiple records and you try and create those records and there are duplicate rule issues, your flow is going to fail. So the trick here is, how do we handle these failures? How do we avoid having that user experience? Well, let's take a look at a couple of different ways you can do this in your flows. Let's look at option A. And I've seen people do this. One way you can get around having these type of issues is you can reproduce every validation rule that you've defined for your object. You can reproduce that validation rule in your flow. But keep in mind, when you do a validation rule, I think it comes out, it has to be a positive outcome of the formula. But when you're checking a validation in a flow, it has to be a negative outcome of the formula. So you got to kind of reverse what you do when you're in your object manager and setting up validation rules. You can have your flow, after they've entered information in, go and check the length of all of your text fields to make sure that they're not exceeding the maximum number of characters that you've defined for those text fields. You can add some loops to your flow. You can check the duplicate records yourself before you go on and try and create the updates. You can go and make sure that any fields that you've defined as required fields actually have entries in them, and add all of those checks. So you have the ability in a flow to go and reproduce all of these tests and validation checks and everything else that you do when you set something up in the object manager. Now, keep in mind that when you do this, you better do this for every flow where you're working with these records. And you're also going to have to go back in and update each and every one of those flows anytime you go into your configuration on your object and make any changes to a field length or validation rule or anything else. So it's a lot of extra work to try and reproduce validation in a flow that you've already defined once when you're in your object manager. Option B, I think, is a better option. And this is to add my validation checker flow action to your flows to take care of all of those tests and validation checks that you've already taken the time and effort to create in the object manager, to check those ahead of time before you try and update or create a record. So there's an example of a flow where I've done the same thing that we were looking at earlier. I get an account record. I'm going to enter some new values. I'm going to assign those to some account fields. But before I try and save that updated record, I'm going to just put this flow action in here to say, check the validation ahead of time. And the validation check will come back and tell me, did I have any errors or not? If I did have errors, I can display them to the user and then do something else. If there are no errors, I can feel confident that now I can do my save, my updated record, and not have to worry about the flow failing and sending out that crazy email message. So basically, what does this validation checker do? It basically goes and looks at the record or collection of records that you want to commit to the database, and it's going to let you know ahead of time, were there any validation rule errors, any field size overruns, any lookup filter validations, were any required fields missing, are there duplicates that shouldn't be there. So it'll make all of these checks, and it's going to do this ahead of time and let you know whether or not you had any of these errors and what they were. So you can then determine how you want your flow to proceed and if you want to present that information to your users. You could also put this action right in your fault path. So let's say you do try and create a record ahead of time or update a record, and it does have a fault because one of these errors was triggered. Rather than just presenting that unknown error message to the user, you can use this action to say, hey, I know there was errors. I'm on my fault path. I can still go out and get a list of what those errors are and display them in a way that I choose to my users before I then go on and do something else in my flow. So you can include this right in a fault path too, if you prefer. Another option, and we'll go through this one, this is a little more involved flow where I'm doing the same thing. I'm getting some input from the user. I'm setting some field values. I'm checking for any errors in my validation, and then I'm making a decision based on the fact, were there errors or no errors? And if there were, this flow is going to pop up a toast message saying, hey, there's an error. I'm going to present a new screen to the user saying, you had errors, do you want to try again? Or are you going to exit? So we're giving the user the ability to correct those errors if it's caught and loop back to that original screen and try and put the information in correctly this time. So let's see how that particular flow is set up. This is just a test flow on a page here. We'll go actually through this as part of the demo as well, but it's collecting some fields, getting some information. Then if there's an error message, the toast message pops up with what the error message was, or what the error is, and now the flow is displaying a couple buttons. Do you want to try again, or are we going to exit the flow? So how do we create this, or how do we configure this action? It's pretty simple. There's only a few inputs and a few outputs to use the flow action. You pass in either a single record or a collection of records. There's another optional parameter where you can specify the API name of a field that you want to use as part of the error message that is passing back, a field that can identify what record it is. Typically, people will pick a name field, for example, and that'll be included in the error message. And then there's a couple options there as well. One is whether or not you want to do a duplicate check or not. There is a little additional overhead when you are doing duplicate checks, so I leave that as an option, whether you want to do it or not. And then there's also another option in there that you can actually have this component do your record update or do your record create for you as part of the flow action if there were no errors found. So you could not even have to use that record update or that record create in your flow. This action can actually perform that for you, assuming there were no errors. There's just a few outputs that come out of this. It's going to give you a true-false value that's going to be set to true if there's any errors, false if not. It'll return the error message or messages that it found on those records. And then if you're actually doing the record update or the record create, it'll return the record ID or a collection of record IDs for all of the new records that may have been created as part of this flow, so you have those to use somewhere else in your flow. So this is what the input screen looks like when you drag this flow action onto your flow canvas and select the check validation apex action. It is set up so it can be used with any standard and any custom object. So it asks you ahead of time, like a lot of these components do, what object are we working with? So we tell it that ahead of time, and then it lets us put in the rest of the attributes, the optional attributes for checking for duplicates. Do we actually want to do the insert or the update if there are no errors? But then the required inputs are either the input record or input record collection, and then the name of the field that we're going to use to identify any errors. And the outputs coming from it, this is just a sample display from a flow that just is returning the result of any errors and then the error messages. So let's see this in action. And this fine gentleman from the Food Network likes to say, I'm about to show you how it's done. So here was the flow that we looked at originally that caused the error. But let's just run through that and see what's going to happen here. So if I take that flow, instead of having the errors, I changed it so I'm doing my check validation instead of just trying to update the record. And then when I go run the flow, I'm picking an account. I have some input fields here. I can provide some values here. I'm going to take a required number field and I'm going to clear it out. I click next and it comes back and said, hey, you had an error. It's given me the name of the record because I said use the name field, the University of Arizona, and then the error message says required fields are missing, and it said the test number field is missing. We go and try this again. Yes.
Hate to interrupt you, but we've got quite a few notifications here that it looks like your screen share is stuck on the account setup screen.
Oh my, how do we fix that?
Might just need to unshare and reshare if we can't do anything else.
Are we seeing something different now?
Now we're on the test validation trap error screen.
Perfect. Somehow it paused itself. I apologize for that. Let's go back. I'm going to back a slide. Okay, so I was on this screen here, so we're going to show you how it's done. We'll restart the demo, and here is the flow that basically this is the one that will cause an error if we go and run it, just trying to update the records with bad information. So if we change this flow to actually do the check validation action, it's going to trap those errors, and then I can display those errors to the user. So let's take a look at this in action. I'm going to run the flow. I'm going to select an account. And here's where I'm taking that required number field. I'm going to clear it out. And I'm going to say, let's update the record without that. And it comes back and says, for this record, a required field is missing. So it trapped the error, and told me I had the error, and it's telling me what the error message is. So we run this again. Let's try forcing a different error. I'll pick the same account, and I'll put in a value here. I got a validation rule that says this test integer field is invalid if you type in the number 7. And sure enough, it traps this. It says the test integer cannot be 7. That's the error from my validation rule. So it's returning that to me. It trapped that error for me ahead of time. So if we go and take a look at this, let's see if I get to the next screen here. I'm going to try and find, as I said, I pre-recorded all of these. I want to make sure I try to keep up with what I was showing. Here we are. So here's an example of a flow where basically I am taking I'm doing the validation check, and then I'm doing a decision to say, was there an error? And if no errors, I update my record. If there is an error, I'm going to show that error, and then we'll proceed in the flow. So we'll run this as a test flow. Let's go in again. I'm going to run through the same steps. And this time, what am I going to do here? Get rid of the required number field. Click next. It's going to show me I have the error, so it did not make the update. I think this is what I ran through before. Again, I apologize for repeating that. Oh, no, here we go. Here I'm going to try not having any errors. And the flow completed and it restarted. So it's not stopping, it's not displaying any errors. There weren't any errors, so it can proceed down that different path in the flow because it didn't find any errors. Also, if I make a change and also have an error, this is just to show you that when it traps that error, I had that number 7 in a field that didn't allow it. I changed my other field from 99 to 100. Just to show you that when you do have an error like that, it doesn't do any updates. So it trapped the error, it didn't make any of the other changes. So it's an all or nothing. Either you're going to be updating your record or you're not, depending upon whether or not there are any errors. So this is the flow we looked at earlier that pops up the toast message and gives the user the option of whether they want to proceed or not if there's an error. This is to show you how I configured this. Here's that same screen where I'm collecting some information from the user. I take those values that I collected in the screen, I assign them to some fields on my account variable, and then I pass that account record variable into my flow action, and I'm saying, go and check this record to see if there are any errors. And I also had an option on that screen to actually, do I want to commit the changes if there are no errors or not? And that was something that the user can pick ahead of time as well. So if there weren't any errors, it could optionally commit those changes, and it's done. If there are errors, it's taking that error message that is passed back from the component, right there, the validation error messages, and it's displaying that as part of the toast message. And then once that toast message displays, I'm just using another component from unofficial SF, these navigation buttons, where I'm presenting, do they want to try again or exit? Then the decision is checking what button was clicked, and it'll proceed in that flow based on what button the user selected, whether they're going to continue or they're going to exit. So here's the flow on a record page. Here's a field that I have a limit of 10 characters. So let's test it with trying to put in more than 10 characters. And I put 11 characters in. I'm going to click on next. And it says the data value is too large. The maximum length is 10. And now it's showing me in the flow, do I want to try again or do I want to exit? So I have a choice. If I click try again, it takes me back to the start of the flow. It gives me a chance to make a correction. And then I can put the information in correctly this time. I click next. It'll check the validation again to see if there were any errors or not. And this time, hopefully, there were no errors. So it'll make the changes and the flow is done. So that was the message at the end. There were no errors, no error messages, and I completed my flow successfully.
Perfect. So Eric, we got a couple questions that came in.
Awesome.
So number one, can you show the Apex component that you used again? And I know you're in a recorded demo, so I don't know if you have the ability to find that spot or if we can pull it up live.
Do that. I'll do that at the end of the presentation.
Perfect.
I'd be glad to what that is. And by the way, this component is available on Unofficial SF. It can be downloaded for free and installed in a sandbox or production org. And the source code is also available directly from unofficialsf.com. So you can take a look and study how I did this and even modify it or change it if you have particular use needs that the generic version of this component doesn't address.
Awesome. So the second question we have is, if there is an error, can you fix it using previous? And I assume that means the previous button in the flow. Jessica, if I got that wrong, please correct me.
Yes, you can, because that's basically what I was doing on this flow here. Is there was an error. I have the option here. I could have gone and just gone right back to this screen. I didn't even have to pop up a toast message. I didn't have to present any buttons to the user. I could have just gone back to that screen. And I could have even conditionally displayed what that error message was on this screen. So the first time through with no errors, it wouldn't display at all. But if you redirected the user back to this screen and there was an error, you could conditionally have that error displayed on the screen and the user has to try again. So you can actually build that right into your flow. I use this example here to have a little more interaction with the user, but you don't necessarily have to do that.
Fantastic. I think that takes care of us for now.
Great. I'm going to show one more example. This is a flow here. I'm just going to do this simple one again I had in the beginning just to show how the validation rule, the duplicate rule portion of this works. So I have a slightly different screen here where I have some of these fields, and I want to create 2 new accounts. And I'm putting some field values in ahead of time for those accounts. And I have an option here that I'm going to pass into my action that said, do I want to check for duplicates or not? Once I have those fields from my screen, I'm creating 2 different account records. I'm just preloading those values based on the information that came from those various screen components. So I now have a collection of records here. I created 2 records in that first assignment. Now I'm adding each of those records to a collection of records. And then this time when I call the action, rather than passing in a single input record, I pass it in my record collection. So I can check multiple records for validation errors, and it'll give you error messages for each and every record that has an error when you run the action. So let's see this in action here. Take just a moment to catch up with my recording. And here is the final screen. I'm just displaying here if there were any error messages or not, and then what those errors are.
So I think we're stuck again. I'm still on your Apex action screen.
All right.
There we go. Test validation insert showed up.
Yep. I don't know why it's pausing, but thank you for pointing that out. So here I'm going to create a couple new accounts, and I'm going to give them the same name. But I left something out here. I forgot to fill out a couple of my other fields, so it trapped that error. It says, wait a minute, you got some other errors here. So I needed to pick a new owner for the account that I'm creating. All right, tell it again. I want to check for duplicates. I'll put in my account names. I've got my account owner. Said, oh, still not going to do anything. You got some required fields that I'm missing. I didn't fill in a value for my required field. So let's make sure I got a value there. And I'm going to check for duplicates. I'll put my account names in, and let's see what happens. And now it says I have a duplicate rule error. My standard account duplicate rule, which is active, it failed when I tried to create 2 accounts with the same name. So let's just run this one more time, and rather than using Acme and Acme, let's use automation for one account, and we'll use hour for the other account, and see if it lets it go through. Perfect. No errors. It gives me the IDs of the 2 new records that it created, and this test flow is completed successfully.
Perfect. We got another question that came in. Aiden would like to know, how does this action differ from using a fault line that points to a screen component that shows a $flow.fault message?
The primary difference in that is it gives you the ability to, well, 2 things. One is it's letting you know ahead of time whether there's an error or not by returning that Boolean value to a flow variable that you can assign. And it allows you to include or change the format of that error message based on the text that comes back from the component. In this case, by default, it's giving the record name or any other field that you want to use to identify the record that has the error, along with the actual error message itself. So it's a different way of presenting these types of errors. And it can be done in your fault path, or better yet, you can do it by not even having to have a fault path, because you can trap these errors ahead of time.
All right. I think that might be all the questions we have for now.
Okay. I'd be glad to show what the component looks like.
That would be great.
All right, just firing up VS Code here on my system, and I will find the source code. Okay. So this is an Apex action where I'm exposing some attributes to a flow. So this is written in Apex. I have the invocable variables, which is my input. These are the inputs that we see when we drag this component onto the flow canvas. Also identified as invocable variables, the results that get passed back to the flow. And then it goes through a little bit of setup in Apex to load up your attributes, your parameters, and then create the response that's going to be sent back. Then I have some logic in here to process those attributes, whether I'm going to be handling a single record or a collection of records. I do some validation ahead of time within my Apex to say, have you gotten the right inputs in order to process this? And I'm using a database operations in Apex to actually try and ahead of time write these records out to the database. But I'm doing it in Apex rather than in the flow. And by doing this in Apex, it allows me, while I'm doing this in the Apex code, to trap the errors ahead of time. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to insert or update these records, and I'm doing it in such a way that if there is an error when I do try and do that, I'm trapping that in the Apex ahead of time, and I'm checking for the errors. I have another check here for duplicates, if that was one of the options that was selected. And then if there are errors, I build my response, I send that back, and I roll back any operations in the database that it tried to make in order to go and check these errors, unless the user selected the option when they configured this to actually keep those commitments to the database. Either keep the updated records or keep the new records in place. Otherwise, it'll just roll that back before it passes control back to the flow. So it's not a very big component. It's only 300 lines long, including all my comments, and that's how it's done.
Fantastic. So are we ready to open it up for additional questions or?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Well, I know I have one to start us off while we're waiting for everyone else to type their questions in. Are there any potential limitations with this component that you've written that we should be aware of?
Actually, there are, and I did cover that in my blog post where I write about this component. But in case somebody asks that question, I actually do have a bonus slide here. There are a few restrictions or just behavior characteristics that you need to be aware of. And one is if there are multiple types of errors, it's only going to catch one type of error and return that to you. For example, if you had both a validation rule failure and a required field failure, it's not going to tell you the first time through that you had both of those errors. It's just going to say, I've got an error, and it's going to pass one type of error back. And this is the order here. It's first going to check for any validation rules. If there aren't any validation rule errors, it'll check for required fields, filter violations, and then, the size limit was handled first, and then validation and so on. And the last one was the duplicate rule checks. And the only other limitation was I do restrict this because of limits. I restrict the maximum number of new records you can try and pass through this component in a collection and do a duplicate check to 150 records. So those are really the only behavior things that you really need to be aware of if you go to use this in a flow.
Excellent. So Robert had submitted a question to us, and he would like to know, will this check for invalid pick list values?
Invalid pick list values, I haven't directly tested that. Now, if your pick list field is set to only allow values, in other words, if it's a restricted pick list that only has certain values that are going to be valid, and you have a wrong pick list value, then yes, it should very well trap that error. If it's a record type selection, it probably won't. If, for example, you had a pick list and one of the pick list values was for a record type that's different than the record type that you're checking, it probably won't trap that because the standard pick list component that you use on a flow screen allows you to pick any value no matter what the record type is. If you need to do restrictions of pick list values by record types, then you really need to use a third-party component like the unofficial SF quick choice component rather than the standard pick list input component for a screen.
Excellent. Okay, doing a quick refresh here on the community as well. Andrew had posted, great stuff from Eric. Again, never ceases to amaze me what you come up with. So thank you, Eric.
Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. You probably all realize I'm a pretty stubborn person, and if something doesn't work the way I want it to work, I try and find a way around it. Occasionally, I've been able to do that.
All right, so doing another refresh here super quick just to see if we've got anything else. I think we've gotten through our questions. So, yep, I think we may have gotten everything answered. So we'll just do one last call for questions if anyone has anything else they want to ask. And while we're hanging out waiting for that, Eric, I do just want to say thank you, not only for presenting today, but for all of the great components that you've put on unofficialsf.com. I know one of the other ones is the data table component that's been heavily used by a lot of people, but what other components have you contributed to on the unofficial SF community?
Oh my goodness, a whole bunch. Horizontal line, the quick lookup, navigate everywhere. Oh boy, there's a bunch of other ones. I've got a lot of page components. notice that you can put on a lightning record page, not just for flows, things like toggle buttons and checkbox field update buttons. I've contributed to the image button component. I've got utilities on there, like being able to provide list views of process builders and batch delete inactive process builders and batch delete inactive flows. That can be a pretty time-consuming process if you're doing it one after another using the Salesforce interface. I have a component on there that's great for admins that support multiple apps in a Lightning environment and allows you to switch between apps with a utility bar component. And you can click on an app and immediately switch from one app to another app and stay on the same record, which is kind of a neat thing when you're trying to support a bunch of different users who have different console apps or other things that they might be working with. I've got a utility out there that allows you to export and import flows and process builders between orgs without having to use chain sets. There's a bunch of other ones. It's quite a bit on that site. If folks haven't been to unofficialsf.com and poked around, everybody can find something there that could probably help them out and be put to good use.
Fantastic. I knew you were busy over there. I don't think I realized you were quite that busy over there. So that's fantastic. And I'm going to have to go check out some of those that I didn't know about before. So
yeah,
just did another quick refresh.
Yeah, not just flow screens and not just flow actions, but apps and utilities, page components. There's a lot of other places you can look on that site and find some interesting things to use.
Fantastic. All right, well, I did one last quick refresh and it looks like we may have gotten everyone's questions answered. So as always, we appreciate everyone attending today. The recording will be up shortly. And Eric, thank you again for coming to present and share all of your flow goodness with us today.
Great, glad to do it. And thank you very much and hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.
We'll see you all later. Thanks again.